name is Dr. Alistair Finch. I am writing this from a place I can no longer accurately locate on any map, though I know it to be somewhere within the vast green expanse of the Coconino National Forest in Arizona. This document is my final attempt to chronicle the events at Hutch Mountain Lookout, to apply the historian's discipline to a sequence of events that logic, and indeed sanity, refuse to accommodate. I suppose it is a confession of sorts, though I am no longer certain what crime I have committed, or if I am the victim or the perpetrator. My field is American folklore, with a specific focus on the mythologies of westward expansion. I once held a respectable, if not celebrated, position at a mid-tier university. That life ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, damning discovery of what my department head charitably called significant citation oversights. In my second book, it was plagiarism, of course, a desperate, foolish shortcut taken under the pressure of tenure review. The scandal was contained, but my career was not. I was given the opportunity to resign before the ethics committee could convene, a small mercy that felt like a slow execution. And so I sought exile, not in some far-flung country, but in the heart of the very wilderness I had once studied from the sterile comfort of a library carrel. The U.S. Forest Service had seasonal openings for fire lookouts, a job so anachronistic, so profoundly isolated, it seemed designed for men like me, men with something to escape from, be it the world or themselves. I was assigned to Hutch Mountain Lookout in the Mogollon Rim Ranger District, a posting described to me as remote, with an emphasis that I only now understand. The drive up was a journey through geological time. The red rocks of the lower elevations gave way to the dramatic escarpment of the rim, a 200-mile gash in the earth that forms the southern edge of the Colorado Plateau. The air grew thin and cool, scented with pine. The final miles were a rough, unpaved track that wound through the world's largest contiguous stand of ponderosa pines. A dogaire thicket of trees so dense they seemed to swallow the light. The tower itself was a stark, skeletal finger pointing at the sky. It was a K-brace steel tower 100 feet tall, erected in the 1950s to replace an older structure. As I began the long climb up the metal stairs, the wind picked up, and the entire structure swayed with a low, metallic groan, a disconcerting motion that the orientation manual assured me was perfectly normal. The cab at the top was a 14 by 14 foot glass, walled box, a fragile human observation point suspended over a sea of wilderness. The view was staggering, a 360-degree panorama of forested mesas, distant peaks, and the hazy blue horizon of a continent. Inside, the furnishings were Spartan and functional, a simple wooden bed that was little more than a plywood platform with a thin mattress, a small wood burning stove, a built-in desk, and a chair. But the heart of the room, its functional and spiritual center, was the Osborne Firefinder. It was a beautiful instrument, a 1934 model according to the brass plate on its base, consisting of a large, circular topographic map mounted on a rotating table, with a brass alidade for sighting. It was a tool of absolute certainty, designed to impose geometric order on the chaos of nature. My first hours were spent in methodical procedure, a comforting ritual of taking possession. I performed the daily radio check with the central dispatcher, my voice sounding small and foreign in the vast silence. I familiarized myself with the logbooks, the weather instruments, and the process of orienting the Firefinder, leveling the table, and checking the vertical horsehair in the front sight against a weighted string, just as the old manuals dictated. I was a historian, and this place was a living museum of a forgotten profession. I felt a sense of peace settle over me for the first time in months. The world and its judgments were 1,000 feet below and 100 miles away. It was while unpacking my personal effects that I found the list. Tucked inside a brittle, leather-bound copy of a 1938 Forest Service handbook was a single, laminated sheet of paper, typewritten and clean. At the top, in a simple, no-nonsense font, were the words "Unofficial Rules. Hutch Mountain Lookout." I chuckled, assuming it was a prank, a piece of workplace folklore left to spook the new guy. As a folklorist, I appreciated the effort. I laid it on the desk to read. Rule Description 1. Conduct radio checks at 08 hours and 18 hours. Speak only for as long as necessary. Do not engage in casual conversation. 2. After sunset, do not use binoculars or the fire finder to observe any light source not marked on the official map. 3. The sound of a woman humming is only the wind in the guy wires. Do not attempt to locate its source. 4. If you hear an elk bugle after midnight, check your watch. If it is before 03 hours, it is an elk. If it is after 0300, it is not. Turn off your lantern and do not look out the windows until sunrise. 5. Log all weather data on the hour. If the anemometer stops spinning on a windy night, do not go outside to check it. Report it as an equipment malfunction in the morning. 6. You may see old signal fires on the mesas to the east. They are not real. Do not log them. Do not report them. 7. Never refer to the mountain by any name other than Hutch Mountain over the radio. 8. If a visitor arrives unannounced, do not respond to their calls. Do not make eye contact. They will leave after 13 minutes. If they do not, you have already made eye contact. 9. The queen of the night cactus at the base of the tower blooms once a year. If it blooms more than once, you have not been diligent in your observations. 10. Do not consume any food or drink left by a previous lookout. 11. If you find a new name carved into the plotting table, do not touch it. Report a routine smoke at azimuth 333 and await instructions. 12. Do not speak its name. I read them over twice, a smile playing on my lips. It was a well-crafted piece of folk horror, touching on classic tropes, the uncanny sound, the arbitrary deadline, the thing that mimics a familiar form. Rule Phase 6 even had a historical basis. The Apache used to communicate with signal fires across these very mesas. I folded the list and placed it in my journal, a curious artifact of my new solitary life. The first day passed in a haze of quiet contentment. I watched the sun trace its long arc across the sky, turning the greens of the forest to gold, then orange, then a deep, bruised purple. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the incessant, clicking chirp of cicadas in the trees below. As darkness fell, a profound, star-dusted blackness unlike anything I had ever experienced, I made my first log entry, noting the temperature, wind speed, and visibility. I felt like a monk in a celestial scriptorium. I read for a few hours, the hiss of my propane lantern a comforting companion. The isolation was not a burden, it was a balm. Here, I was not the disgraced Dr. Finch. I was simply Hutch Lookout, a voice on the radio, an observer. I finally turned in around midnight, lulled to sleep by the gentle creaking of the tower. I awoke sometime later, unsure what had disturbed me. The cab was bathed in the cold, white light of a full moon. And then I heard it, a sound both majestic and mournful, echoing up from the dark canyons below. An elk's bugle. It was a beautiful, wild sound, the very essence of this untamed place. I smiled in the darkness, feeling a kinship with the creature, another solitary being calling out into the night. I lay there, listening, hoping to hear it again. After a few minutes, I glanced at the luminous dial of my watch on the bedside table. It was 3:07 a.m. A cold dread, immediate and absolute, washed over me. If it is after order 3 hours, it is not. The words from the list, which had seemed so amusing in the daylight, now felt like a death sentence. The air in the cab grew heavy and still. The wind had died. The tower was silent. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. Slowly, deliberately, my hand trembling in the moonlight, I reached over and extinguished the lantern. The hiss died, plunging the world into absolute, suffocating darkness, and I lay there, eyes wide open, staring at a ceiling I could not see, waiting for the dawn. The sun rose, but the darkness of the preceding night lingered, a cold residue in the corners of the cab. I tried to rationalize the experience as I went through my morning procedures. It was a prank, I told myself, a psychological game played on the newcomer. The previous lookout had likely learned my schedule, my habits, and set up a timed recording. It was an elaborate, but ultimately logical, explanation. As a historian, I knew how easily the human mind, especially one in isolation, could be tricked into seeing patterns where none existed. I focused on my duties, on the comforting solidity of routine. I made my O8 radio check, keeping my voice even and professional, betraying none of my nocturnal anxiety. Then, I turned to the Osborne Firefinder. My morning ritual was to check its orientation against a known, distant landmark, a distinctively shaped butt marked on the map as Red Knoll. I slid the alidate around the brass ring, peered through the rear sight, and aligned the vertical horsehair with the butt's peak. I glanced down at the vernier scale to check the reading. It was supposed to be exactly 284 degrees. The needle rested on the 284 degrees and 4 minutes. A tiny discrepancy, a fraction of a degree, it could be anything. A slight warping of the table from the night's chill, a trick of the light, my own unsteady hand. But it was wrong. The Firefinder was an instrument of precision, a relic from an age when certainty was forged in brass and steel. This deviation, however small, felt like a crack in the foundation of my world. I logged it as instrument drift and tried to put it from my mind. Later that afternoon, as I was preparing a meager lunch, I heard it. A faint, melodic sound, seemingly coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was the sound of a woman humming a simple, haunting tune. Rule Fein 3. The sound of a woman humming is only the wind in the guy wires. I stood perfectly still, listening. There was a steady breeze, and the tower's support cables did vibrate with a low thrum. But this was different. It had structure. It was a melody, one that seemed to brush against the edge of my hearing before retreating, a sonic ghost. I went to each window, trying to pinpoint the source. But it was impossible. The sound was simply there, woven into the fabric of the air. I told myself it was an auditory illusion, a trick of the wind passing through the pines, but the explanation felt thin and hollow. The true turning point came 3 days later. I had been meticulously following the rules, treating them no longer as a joke, but as a set of bizarre but necessary operating procedures. I avoided looking out the windows after midnight. I ignored the faint signal fires that flickered to life on the eastern mesas just after dusk, just as Rule Phase 6 dictated. I was adapting, compartmentalizing. In the back of a supply cupboard, behind a stack of dusty logbooks, I found a small, unlabeled tin of coffee grounds. It was clearly old, left behind by a previous occupant. I remembered Rule Fate Heaveny, do not consume any food or drink left by a previous lookout. But my own supply was running low, and the thought of a strong, hot cup of coffee was too tempting. It's just coffee, I reasoned. What harm could it do? I brewed a pot on the stove. It was dark and intensely bitter, with an odd, earthy aftertaste, like chicory and damp soil. I drank it, and that night, I had a dream. It was not a dream so much as a transmission. I was standing on the ground, 100 feet below, looking up at the tower. It was silhouetted against a sick, purple sky. I could see a figure in the cab, standing by the window, looking out. But it wasn't me. This figure was impossibly tall and gaunt, its limbs thin and stretched, like a Giacometti sculpture. Its head was tilted at an angle that would have snapped a human neck. It raised a long, skeletal hand and waved down at me. A slow, deliberate gesture of ownership. I woke up with a gasp, my mouth filled with the distinct, gritty taste of dirt. The dream shattered my composure. The line between my own mind and the influence of this place was blurring. I was a scientist, a man of evidence and reason. I needed to test the phenomena, to control one of the variables. I decided to deliberately break a rule, one that I could observe and document. I chose Rule Pave 2 after sunset. Do not use binoculars or the Firefinder to observe any light source not marked on the official map. That night, I waited. Just as on previous nights, a single, faint light flickered into existence on a remote, unnamed mesa to the southeast. It wasn't a campfire. It was too steady, too isolated. My historian's curiosity battled with a primal fear. The journals of early settlers in this region were filled with tales of strange lights in the wilderness, lights they called ghost fires, or spirit lights. My hands shook as I moved to the fire finder. I swung the alidate around, the brass cooled beneath my fingers. I took a deep breath and put my eye to the rear sight, aligning the crosshairs on that distant, forbidden light. For a moment, it was just as I expected. The light magnified a simple point of incandescence. But as I fine-tuned the focus, it began to change. It wasn't a fire. The light coalesced, sharpened, and resolved itself into something impossible. It was an eye, a single, vast, unblinking eye, ancient and intelligent, staring directly back at me through the instrument. It was not a reflection. It was a connection. I felt its gaze not on my face, but inside my skull, a cold, analytical pressure that sifted through my thoughts, my memories, my fear. I cried out and stumbled back, knocking over my chair. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. When I dared to look again, the light on the mesa was gone. The night was just a star-filled void. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the brass casing of the fire finder. It was ice cold, radiating a deep, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The wall of my skepticism, already cracked, crumbled into dust. This was not a prank. This was not a product of my isolated mind. This was real, and it knew I was here. It knew I was watching. The isolation I had craved now became a cage. The endless forest was no longer a beautiful vista. It was a place for something to hide. The wind was no longer a neutral sound. It was a carrier of whispers. I began to feel its presence constantly, a weight in the air, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, the unnerving sensation of being perpetually watched. My log entries, once neat and clinical, became terse, the handwriting tight and cramped. I spent the next day in a state of heightened paranoia, jumping at every sound, sweeping the horizon with my naked eyes, afraid to even touch the fire finder. As evening approached, I was cleaning the map on the instruments table, wiping away the day's dust, when my fingers brushed against something rough. I looked closer. There, on the smooth, polished surface of the plotting table, near the central pivot point that marked my own location, was a new carving. It was a single word, etched into the wood with what looked like a fingernail. The letters were shaky but unmistakable. It was a name. Phi-NH. My blood ran cold. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat, and then I remembered the 11th rule. If you find a new name carved into the plotting table, do not touch it. Report a routine smoke at azimuth 333 and await instructions. I had already touched it. My hand recoiled from the plotting table as if from a hot stove, though the wood was cool and smooth beneath my fingertips. Phi-NH. My name, scratched into the heart of the map, a declaration of presence, a claim. The entity wasn't just watching me, it was learning me, cataloging me, adding me to its collection. Panic gave way to a strange, cold clarity. I was no longer a neutral observer or a skeptical academic. I was a participant in a long and terrible history. My only hope for survival, it seemed, was to adhere to the system that had been established to manage this thing. I moved to the radio, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I keyed the microphone. Flagstaff dispatch, this is Hutch Lookout with a routine smoke report. Over. The reply was instantaneous, the dispatcher's voice flat and devoid of curiosity. Hutch, send your traffic. Over. Flagstaff, I have a single, thin, white smoke. Azimuth is 333. Repeat 333. No visible flame. Estimate 5 miles. Over. I recited the lines from Rule 11, the words feeling alien in my mouth. Azimuth 333 pointed to a featureless stretch of pine forest northwest of my position. There was no smoke. There was a pause, longer than usual. Then, the dispatcher's voice returned with a subtle but unmistakable change in cadence. It was clip, formal coded. Received, Hutch, 333. Stand by and continue observation. Do not break radio silence until advised. Dispatch out. The click of the radio severing the connection was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Stand by and continue observation. It was a confirmation. They knew. Whoever they were. The Forest Service, some hidden branch of it. They knew what Hutch Mountain was. The rules were not folklore, they were a protocol, a containment procedure. And I was the bait. A new kind of fear took hold, colder and more profound than the simple terror of being hunted. It was the fear of being a pawn in a game, whose rules I was only just beginning to understand. I had to know more. I had to find the context. My historian's instincts, long dormant, surged to the forefront. If this tower had a history, it would be recorded somewhere. I searched the cab with a desperate energy. The official logbooks were useless, filled with dry notations of weather data and supply requests. But as I was replacing the mattress on the plywood bed frame, my hand brushed against a loose floorboard. My breath hitched. I pried it up with my fingers. Beneath it, in a shallow, dust-filled cavity, was a tin box, rusted at the hinges. Inside were 4 leather-bound journals, the kind used for field notes, their pages yellowed and fragile. They were the real logs, the unofficial history of Hutch Mountain Lookout, dating back to the 1930s. I sat down at the desk. The journals spread before me like sacred texts, and I began to read. The first entry was dated July 12, 1936, the handwriting a neat, looping cursive. The writer was a young man with the Civilian Conservation Corps, sent to man the original wooden tower. For the first few weeks, his entries were full of the wonder of the place. The spectacular sunsets, the herds of elk, the profound silence. Then the tone began to change. August 4, 1936, I heard voices on the wind again last night, clear as a bell. 2 men talking, but I couldn't make out the words. Reminds me of the stories the old Apache ranch hands tell about the nail, Lushi, the mimics. They say they can steal a man's voice and his face. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I turned the pages, my fingers trembling. The entries became a catalog of uncanny events, a secret history of fear. A lookout in 1958, a woman named Eleanor, wrote about a man who would appear at the base of the tower on moonless nights. June 22, 1958, he was here again. The man who isn't a man. He just stands by the tree line watching. He doesn't have a face. Not that it's blank, but that it's wrong. Like a blurred photograph. I don't think he can climb. I pray to God he can't climb. I found an entry from the summer of 1972, written by a man whose name I recognized. A famous, cantankerous environmental writer who had romanticized his time as a lookout. His public writings spoke of solitude and beauty. His private journal told a different story. July 18, 1972, this place is not empty. There is a presence here, an intelligence. It is not hostile, not yet. It is curious. It watches the watchers. It is the true genius loci of this place, the spirit of the mountain itself. And I believe it is learning. The journals revealed everything. The entity was ancient, intelligent, and territorial. It was drawn to the act of sustained observation. The tower, a tool for watching the forest, had become a focal point for its attention. The rules were a painfully acquired set of countermeasures, each one born from a tragedy. A lookout who went mad trying to find the source of the humming. A man who disappeared after reporting the signal fires. A woman who was found catatonic, her last log entry a single, scrawled word, visitor. The name carved on the plotting table was a prelude, a sign that the entity had focused its attention, and the period of passive observation was ending. As I was reading a particularly harrowing account from 1985, I heard a shout from below. "Hello, the tower! Anybody home?" My blood turned to ice. I crept to the window and peered down. A man in a crisp Forest Service uniform stood at the base of the stairs, shielding his eyes and looking up. He looked normal. He looked real. My truck's broken down about a mile back. He called out. "Radio's on the fritz. Mind if I come up and call it in?" Rule Fay 8. If a visitor arrives unannounced, do not respond to their calls. Do not make eye contact. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering. I remained silent, pressing myself against the far wall. "Hello, I can see the light on up there. I'm an officer of the Forest Service. I just need to use your radio." His voice was friendly, reasonable. But I stayed silent. The seconds ticked by, stretching into an eternity. His tone began to change. "Come on now. "Don't be rude," he called, a note of irritation creeping in. "I know you're up there. Regulations require you to render assistance. Silence. Fine. Be that way." His voice dropped, losing its folksy charm, becoming something cold and flat. "I know you're up there, Dr. Finch." The last historian wasn't nearly so rude. The use of my name, my title, struck me like a physical blow. I risked a glance out the window. He was still there, but in the shifting afternoon shadows, his form seemed fluid. A limb seemed to stretch, just for a second, a little too long. His shadow on the ground seemed to detach from his feet, writhing like a separate creature. He waited. I waited. The manual said 13 minutes. I watched the second hand on my watch sweep around and around. It was a psychological siege. At the exact moment the 13th minute passed, the figure below looked up, directly at my window, even though I was hidden in shadow. It smiled, a smile that was impossibly wide, splitting its face in a gash of white. Then it turned, and with a movement that was not walking but flowing, it melted back into the dense shadows of the ponderosa pines. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking uncontrollably. The entity was a mimic. It could take a human form. It knew my name. It knew my past. I scrambled back to the journals, my hands slick with sweat, searching for a weakness, a way to fight back. I found a series of cryptic, recurring references, scattered across decades, to the Piniocereus gregii, the queen of the night cactus that grew in a small, protected patch at the base of the tower. One entry from 1964 was circled in red ink. "It is not the watcher, it is the eye. The bloom is the pupil." Suddenly Rule 89, which had seemed so poetic and strange, made a horrifying kind of sense. If it blooms more than once, you have not been diligent in your observations. The cactus wasn't just a plant. It was a sensory organ, a biological instrument connected to the entity, just as the fire finder was my mechanical one. The journals stated it bloomed once a year, in late June. It was now early August. I crawled to the window and looked down at the patch of cactus. There, on one of the thin stick-like stems, was a single, pale, tightly closed bud. A second bloom. It had been watching me through that flower, through that living eye, this entire time. And I had not been diligent. I had not noticed. As the horrifying realization settled in, the sky to the west, which had been clear moments before, began to darken with an unnatural speed. A low, distant rumble echoed across the mazes. A monsoon storm was rolling in. The storm did not roll in. It fell upon the mountain like a hammer blow. The sky turned a bruised, malevolent purple, black, and the first clap of thunder was a physical concussion that shook the tower to its foundations. Rain came not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, blurring the windows and transforming the world into a churning chaos of water and noise. This was not just a storm, it was an attack. It was the entity using the raw power of the climate as its weapon, a monster that could wield the weather. The power flickered and died. The propane lantern, my only source of light, sputtered out as if starved of oxygen. The radio crackled with a burst of static and then went silent. I was cut off, trapped in a glass box 100 feet in the air, at the mercy of the storm and the thing that rode within it. The tower groaned and swayed, the sound of straining metal, a terrifying counterpoint to the howling wind. Then came a new sound, a series of heavy, rhythmic impacts against the tower's steel legs below. THEMP, THEMP. It was too slow, too deliberate for random debris. It was the sound of something immense and powerful, trying to climb. A flash of lightning bleached the world white for a horrifying instant. In that split second, I saw it. It was not one creature, but many, or one creature with many limbs. A flowing, protein mass of darkness, blacker than the storm, was wrapped around the base of the tower. It was a thing of too many joints and impossible angles, a nebulous horror that defied description, moving through the thrashing ponderosa pines like an octopus through a kelp forest. It was the source of the thumping, the faceless man, the mimic. It was everything. I scrambled away from the windows, pressing myself into the corner of the cab, making myself small. My mind, the rational, academic mind of Dr. Alastair Finch, had ceased to function. All that was left was animal terror. The tower was a ship in a hurricane, and the sea monster was trying to get in. And then, a new sound began, cutting through the cacophony of the storm. Sealange. It was the sound of a large, iron bell, deep and resonant. It seemed to come from the base of the tower. I had never seen a bell, sealange. The sound vibrated up through the steel structure, through the soles of my feet, and into my bones. It was a pure, clean tone of absolute menace. Sealange, 3 times. My mind, frantic, latched onto the only source of order it had left, the journals. I fumbled in the darkness, my hands finding the last, most recent journal. I flipped it open, my fingers searching for the final pages. There, scrawled in a desperate, barely legible hand, was an entry that wasn't on my laminated list. It was written under the heading, "What to do if it rings." Rule 13E, the storm is its voice, but the bell is its heart. If it rings 3 times, you must descend and wrap the chain before the 4th, or the tower will become the heart. I read the words again in the intermittent flashes of lightning, and the true, diabolical nature of the trap was revealed. It was a paradox, a horrifying choice designed by a malevolent intelligence. The rules, my only hope of survival, had been turned against me. I had to break the unspoken, cardinal rule of every lookout. Never leave the safety of the tower during an attack, never go down to face the monster. But if I stayed, the tower itself, my only sanctuary, would become the monster. Damned if I did, damned if I didn't. It was the ultimate expression of horror, the removal of all agency, the victim placed entirely at the mercy of the monster. The wind howled, tearing at the cab. The thumping against the legs grew more frantic. The entire structure shuddered, and I heard the sickening screech of metal beginning to buckle. Outside, the world was a nightmare of roaring wind and lashing rain. Down there, in the dark, the thing was waiting. The bell was silent. The 4th toll was yet to come. I was on my feet, my hand on the trapdoor that led to the stairs, to descend into the storm, into the darkness, to face the thing that wore 1,000 faces. Or to stay and wait for the tower to claim me, to become another entry in a dusty journal. The choice was mine, and it was no choice at all. The logbook lies open on the desk. The sun is bright. The air is clean and crisp with the promise of a new fire season. The entry is dated today. The handwriting is mine, yet it feels like a forgery, shaky and thin, the script of a stranger. May 15. New lookout arrived 0800. Young man full of academic confidence. Name of Peterson. Seems capable. Inventoried equipment with him. Handed him the 1938 handbook. I pause, the pen hovering over the page. I can see him down there now, at the base of the tower, looking at the queen of the night cactus. He is smiling. He thinks it's beautiful. He doesn't know it's an eye. He doesn't know it's open. I continue writing. He laughed at the laminated page inside. He'll learn. I close the logbook. The dispatcher will be calling for the morning check soon. I must be ready. I must be professional. I walk to the window and look out at my forest, my mountain. The view from up here is so clear. You can see everything. It's important to be a good observer.